Let's talk now to David Otto, who joins us from the British capital, London. David, always a pleasure to see you. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Let's talk about these peace talks. Some people have said talks about talks, but they're holding face to face for the first time. And from what uh, analysts on ground in Istanbul, including Doreen Jones, have told us, it looks like both sides are feeling the pinch now, and that might appear to be what is needed to get both sides to make the necessary movements for peace. Is that your reading of the situation, knowing what's going on ground?
First of all, I think it's very early to make any determination as to what these talks for for talks, or however we want to phrase them, how they're going. But of course, one would expect that on day 34 of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there will be talks going on. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky had an informal indication with some Russian journalists. Of course, this has not been published or allowed to be published in the Russian media, as I understand. I think one of the things that he indicated in that media discussion was that, of course, Ukraine is ready to be a neutral country. He also made it very clear that Ukraine, is also ready to consider some of the, separatist areas. But of course, one thing which was much more related to what Russia is asking for is that Ukraine gives that assurance that it will not become a member of NATO and that it will not neutralize. It will not have any nuclear capabilities. But these are just indications, and one of the caveats which the Ukrainian president made was that this has to go through some form of a referendum, and then of course Ukraine needs some level of security guarantees. So it's not just about having these talks; it's also about understanding what Russia is actually looking for. Again, as we always say, if you invade a country for one reason, which perhaps could be the fact that Ukraine, shouldn't be a member of NATO or contemplate joining NATO, now it has extended to the extent where Russia is asking for a complete demilitarization of Ukraine, a denazification of Ukraine, which perhaps it's not something on Ukraine's table at the moment. So yes, we're happy to see these talks taking place in Turkey. We are not sure how this is going to lead to anything concrete, because of course, as you know, and as the audience understand, it is not just about Ukraine and Russia. It's also about what NATO allies and the United States want to get out of this. So it's very early to determine.
Given the fact that, and that was what I was referring to when I talked earlier, all the points you've raised about what President Zelensky seems to be offering now or willing to consider, and then the Russians also admitting that they've taken quite a bit of a hit in terms of casualties and in terms of the economic costs and all of that. But step into the middle now is the Turkish president himself. The earlier talks that were held 2 weeks ago, he's kind of stayed back. But in this one, he's almost like personally involved. And from what we hear, this meeting is supposed to be a prelude, in his view, to a meeting between Presidents Putin and Zelensky themselves, face to face. Because in his view, he believes that only that kind of meeting can lead to the kind of decisions that are needed to bring an end to this. Is that, for you, a viable strategy, talking from the angles that we have been talking?
Yes, of course. I think one thing which Vladimir Putin, who is the Russian president, has made very clear is that he will only attend a face-to-face talk with his Ukrainian counterpart, Volodymyr Zelensky, if there are concrete, propositions, to put it that way, on the table. And perhaps this was indicative of, the statements that Volodymyr Zelensky made recently about the fact that they are ready to consider the neutrality of Ukraine, but of course that they are also ready to, ensure that Ukraine does not have any nuclear capability. But I don't know if this is what Russia will go for, and I don't think this may trigger Vladimir Putin meeting on the table, because of course some of the key things which Vladimir Putin has indicated to be, some sort of, grounds for face-to-face talks, as I mentioned earlier on, is the fact that he wants a complete independence of the Donbas region, especially the Luhansk and Donetsk. Of course, Crimea is already in the hands of Ukraine, of Russia, which was annexed in 2014. He also talked about, as I mentioned earlier on, that he wants a full demilitarization, denazification, which of course refers to the fact that Ukraine, according to Russian's version, is kind of ruled by pro-Nazis, and he thinks that this is having a very serious impact on the Russian natives within Ukraine. So, in other words, he indirectly wants some kind of a regime change within Ukraine, but he hasn't actually said that in principle. So we're still looking at some of these options, but I don't think the Russian president will go for these talks at this point in time. I think what we would say is, the Turkish president Recep Erdogan making some grounds, and then perhaps pulling Russia to come on the table. But it all depends on what both sides are ready to concede, because when it comes to negotiation, you have a position, but then you by going on the table, you're indicating that you're ready to shift your position. So let's see what really will make Russian President Putin to shift his position. Perhaps it could be again the fact that Ukraine is ready to be neutral, but the fact that Ukraine is saying that this is going to go through a referendum, it will make it very challenging, because then it tells us that this is going to take more time than we expect, because a referendum is not something that you just organize in a day or two. So we're still very unclear as to how this is going to work in practice.
When you talked about regime change, it brought to mind the statement from U.S. President Biden, and you talked about this not just being Russia and Ukraine. There are all these other parties who are involved, and the U.S. is one of them. In fact, the U.S. is probably the most powerful other party that is involved in this matter. And there have been indications, or there were indications, that President Biden may have been, signaling policy or talking about the fact that President Putin cannot be in power for much longer, even though he has clarified, and the White House has clarified, that that was not administration policy. It was the president speaking as a person about what he felt was going on. But do you think that kind of comment coming on the eve of these talks may have dropped a fly in the ointment, do you think?
I think it's very difficult for the U.S. to argue in any way that this was a slip of the tongue. Usually, perhaps these conversations are had in private, and then of course the U.S. president then had it in public. They're now taking it back, but it's very difficult to see that such a statement could be a slip of the tongue. I would lean towards the fact that there is an interest, perhaps for the U.S. If there is a change in regime in Russia. Of course, if you look at the practicalities, for example, all the economic sanctions that are being levied on Russia, one of the impact of that is perhaps to drive in a revolution, which will then, unsettle Crimea. And of course, that, practical intervention, would indicate to you and to anyone that, there is that appetite for regime change. But I'm very, uncertain that that will be achieved. I mean, we saw the same thing happening with Syria, and Russia was the main blocker of the regime change in the case of Syria. So, those kind of statements being made, I think, it makes the situation much more complex. And it therefore opens the thought of many that, again, this is not just a war between Ukraine and Russia on the basis of, being a member of NATO. This is, an extension of the Cold War between Russia, NATO, and the United States. So, it's revealed, and it keeps revealing that this is much more of a proxy war rather than a war between Russia and Ukraine, and perhaps that is why Ukraine may have realized that for the betterment of its citizens and its infrastructure, it may be much more practical and useful at this point to engage in a negotiation with Russia, because of course this is going to drag on, and the person who pays the biggest price would be Ukraine and no one else.
That's it. Thank you so very much, David Otto, for your time this morning, as always, for the perspective. David Otto joins us from London, the British capital. Thank you.
Thank you.